All right, folks. So here's the second part of the second part, if you will. So here's the second part of the Reconstruction lecture. So we left off with basically Johnson by, the skinniest of margins, not being the first president removed by the Senate. And so he is not even going to be nominated for president in 1868. War hero Ulysses S. Grant is going to win the election in 1868, but it's going to be by a really small margin, like 300,000 of the 6 million votes cast. Many Republicans are looking at this and they're like, what? How did this happen? I thought we were like in control in the driver's seat. So they are going to push for the adoption of the 15th Amendment, which is going to prohibit federal and state governments from denying any citizen the right to vote because of race. So they're like, you know what? At this point, we have to sort of really cement our legacy and make sure that African Americans have the right to vote. Now, it's only going to be African American males. And again, they didn't do it in the 13th Amendment when they freed slaves. They didn't do it in the Civil Rights Act of 1866. They didn't do it in the 14th Amendment, but finally doing it in the 15th Amendment. Now, the 15th Amendment still allows for certain loopholes, like literacy tests can be used, and property qualifications, and poll taxes, and women can't vote. So it's not like this ironclad, like, oh, wow, we've really, certainly secured the right for Black males to vote. But if you look at it in terms of decades of abolitionist agitation, finally, this is a major moment. Now, when we look at the Reconstruction amendments, and really it's 13th Amendment, freeing of slaves, 14th, which really is citizenship and civil rights, and 15th, which is Black male suffrage, they transformed the Constitution from a document that was primarily concerned with like how to figure out federal-state relations and the rights of property, like we saw, with like John Marshall and things, into a vehicle through which members of vulnerable minorities could stake a claim to freedom and seek protection against misconduct by all levels of the government. And in fact, the 14th Amendment really has been influential, or I should say integral, in the decisions that were made like 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, all the way up to 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges, which prevented states from discriminating against gay Americans and the right to marry. So that's sort of what we call that equal protection clause in the 14th Amendment has been so instrumental. Also quite controversial today, we have what's called the birthright citizenship clause that's in the 14th Amendment that makes the United States different from almost every other country in the world. Most countries, including European countries, limit automatic access to citizenship based on ethnicity or culture or religion. But birthright citizenship, which means if you are born here in the United States, you are a citizen, certainly goes back to what we saw with the radical Republicans really trying to make sure that we sort of broke this connection between white people equals citizen and make it different. But the 14th and the 15th Amendments were incredibly divisive, even within people that had fought for equal rights for Black people and for abolition, particularly suffragettes, women involved in, the 1848 sort of Seneca Falls movement that gets started there. So the 14th Amendment, as I said before, is the first time that we actually see the word male in the Constitution, even though they're not talking actually about male suffrage yet. The 15th Amendment outlaws discrimination based on race and not gender. So now, again, we're going to see sort of the Constitution prioritizing men by putting men in there for the first time in the 14th, and then really, prioritizing Black men over white women and Black women and all other women in terms of not giving them the right to vote. And actually, it created quite a schism within the sort of reformer community. Some, early feminist leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they split from this group that they'd worked as part of in terms of abolition and said, this is not right. You guys, I thought we were in this together. And in fact, it got sort of ugly and they made sort of very racist comments as part of that. Okay. Now, when we look back and we sort of see like what happened politically in the South, because again, once you have the Reconstruction Act in 1867, you have the North taking over the South, dividing into these 5 military districts. It's under martial law. And so over the next really 2.5 years, all the former Confederate states have been readmitted to the Union. They've done what the North told them to do because the North was literally on the ground making it happen. And the Republican Party had not existed at all in the South. Again, we know that Abraham Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in 1860, but the Republican Party controls the entire South. They are the party in power. And all of these states have new constitutions. They're drafted, in 1868, 1869, and they're the first, legislative bodies with, significant Black representation. And that's a huge deal. Okay. There's no other way to think about it. African Americans had not been able to vote. They'd not been able to be in politics. And now all these state governments have maybe not a majority, but a significant number of Black politicians involved. And so these constitutions of these southern states create free public education. They create, better jails, prisons, asylums, homes for the insane. They're really about providing services, for the marginalized people. They also guaranteed equality of civil and political rights, and they abolished practices such as whipping as punishment for a crime, property qualifications for holding political office, and imprisonment for debt. So again, trying to sort of tear down much of this, structure that had been really about the white elite. A few states initially said if you were a former Confederate, you couldn't vote, but that didn't go for that long. Okay. So it's important to understand that African Americans are not just involved at the local level. In fact, 14 African Americans are, elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. 2 Black men are elected to the U.S. Senate, both from Mississippi. So it's not just within these reconstructed states, it's at the federal level that you're seeing Black political representation as well. But at this local level, it's crucial because the presence of Black office holders and white allies. So that's important. There are people that are in the South and people that have come from the North to be allies that make a real difference in Southern life, ensuring that Blacks accused of crimes can be tried before juries of their peers and enforcing fairness. In things as simple as like road repair and tax assessment and relief for the poor. So it's really, really crucial that you see not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level, Black political power. Now, majority of these Black politicians were former slaves. And, they had gotten really important leadership experiences by serving in the Union Army. They worked as ministers and teachers, or with a group called the Union League, which had come down from the North to sort of teach civic and political processes and participation to the freed people. But there are white people that are very much involved in these reconstructed governments. And in fact, for the most part, except for South Carolina, there's a majority white people in these reconstructed governments. And so it's important to understand who these people were, because in some cases, they weren't people in the South. They were people that actually came down from the North. And the people that came down from the North to the South were dubbed by their opponents, their critics, as carpetbaggers. Basically, that means they threw everything into a carpet bag, which is a type of suitcase. And then they came down to the South to sort of exploit it for economic gain. Now, it's true. Some carpetbaggers were probably corrupt and trying to exploit the situation. But the large majority were former Union soldiers who said, I want to remain in the South after the war has ended to really help out this situation. And there were also white allies from the South itself that did not come from the North. And in fact, if you were a white Southerner who was helping Black people, you got the most scorn from, Southern racist Democrats who were like, you are a traitor. And they called them scalawags. So the carpetbaggers were people that came from the North. The scalawags were from the South. And in many cases, these were, like white farmers who were non-slave owners, who people who would have been sympathetic to the Northern cause. And they're just like, listen, we want a South that is powerful, but not run by the white elite. And so when we look at these reconstructed governments that had Black politicians and white politicians, their greatest achievement really was creating public schools. And again, this is something that had really been started by the Freedmen's Bureau and really picked up by the reconstructed governments. And the educational system served both white and black children, although generally in segregated schools. New Orleans was the only place where you actually saw schools integrated during Reconstruction. And in South Carolina, it was the only place where you saw state universities admit black students. Now, again, South Carolina is a bit anomalous because it had more black people than white people within the state itself. And at the same time, you're also going to see civil rights legislation at the state level, making it illegal for railroads and hotels and other institutions to discriminate on the basis of race. And enforcement was not always the strictest. It varied from locality to locality. But for the first time, you're going to see state laws that are designed to create equal protection. So we see it in the 14th Amendment. We're seeing it in state laws. And I think it's really important to understand, however, that it was not perfect. And, to the supporters of these governments, there was not a complete revitalization of the Southern economy. And most African Americans remained in poverty. So for all those people, they're like, look, we recreated these governments. It's great. The economics didn't really work out. But on the other hand, you have a biracial democratic government, something that has never been known in American history. So in many ways, Reconstruction allowed this to happen. And you saw, equal protection laws, you saw public education. But in terms of like true economic prospects, increasing didn't really work out. Now, at the end of the day, the conservative elite, the conservative white elite that had dominated the Southern governments from literally colonial times, so, we see the House of Burgesses in 1619. We're now all the way, 1867, 250 years later, they're not in power anymore. So the exclusion of the white elites from political power, while they watched, poor whites, carpetbaggers, from the North and scalawags from the South and former slaves casting ballots and sitting on juries and enacting, laws. This absolutely just drove the white power elite crazy. And they resented this new government in so many ways. And so it wasn't, in fact, the freeing of the slaves or even really civil rights that inflamed the white power elite so much, or the former white power elite. It was the fact they just could not get over the fact that former slaves were now voting and holding office and enjoying equality before the law. And so you're going to see a really violent and vicious response in terms of a violent effort to really bring down the success that the Republicans were having in the South. And so we did see some violence even before African Americans, were given more political rights, sort of coming right out of the war. But it was mostly sort of local and unorganized. But once you really see the Reconstruction Act in 1867, and you're starting to see, being forced to give Black people the right to vote, and then certainly with the 15th Amendment, you're going to see a far more pervasive and organized effort, basically terrorism. And so secret societies spring up with the aim of preventing Blacks from voting and destroying the organization that the Republicans had built. And the most notorious, and you've heard of it, is Ku Klux Klan. Again, it's not Ku Klux Klan, it's Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, the Klan as it's known, which basically was like a military arm of the Democratic Party in the South. And there were other such sort of paramilitary groups that were out there, the KKK being the most famous, I would say, created the most terror, if you will. And they're a terrorist organization that committed some of the most brutal criminal acts in American history. And they didn't just go after Black people. They went after white Republicans, particularly Southerners, who they saw as, these terrible race traitors who were helping create these Reconstruction governments. They went after teachers, party organizers, Freedmen's Bureau agents. And in many ways, this was, again, causing the Northerners, just as they looked at with the Black codes, they're like, wait, did we not win this war? How is this happening? So in 1870 and 1871, Ulysses S. Grant signed 3 enforcement acts that Congress had passed that really tried to limit these terrorist societies. And they used the federal government to come in and bring in the military backed up by troops to arrest hundreds of accused Klansmen. Many Klansmen left the South, and Foner says that the Klan went out of existence. That's not entirely true. It sort of went underground. It existed. It wasn't so public, but in many ways, this was the federal government trying to bring the hammer down to try to remind them, like, we won the war. However, as we have seen over and over again in 1819 and 1837, 1857, 1873, you're going to have another economic depression. So in 1857, the Panic of 1857 actually helped convince the South that they should or they could sort of strike out on their own, because King Cotton didn't, fare as badly as industry and King Wheat. Now it's like, it sort of makes the North look around. They're like, gosh, do we really want to keep doing this? We've been trying to do Reconstruction since 1865. We've really been at this sort of more hardcore Reconstruction from 1867. We've had to fight against the Black Codes. We've had to fight against the Klan. And now we've got all these economic problems. We really just don't have the resources, economic or emotional or mental, to keep doing this. And they also looked at the South and they're like, our whole goal was to help revitalize the Southern economy. And now we really can't because of this panic. And so at the same time, Democrats start doing better and better in terms of the elections. And in 1874, for the first time since the Civil War, they actually take control of the House of Representatives. So the Republicans had done so well when the Democrats were gone, and then they controlled what was going on in the 1860s. But by 1874, the Southern Democrats have taken control. And so it looks like Reconstruction's just not going to last. But sort of one last gasp effort is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So there was a Civil Rights Act of 1866 and now 1875. And this is going to outlaw racial discrimination in places of public accommodations like hotels and theaters. So in theory, this is a really, really momentous act. In practice, it didn't do much because 2 years later, it's all going to be over. And, white power elite's going to, quote, redeem the South, and Jim Crow is going to take over. You also see the Supreme Court sort of jumping in and saying, yeah, white power is good, which is so hard to conceive that all this is, this Reconstruction sort of died so quickly. But the Supreme Court, in something called the Slaughterhouse Cases, rules that the 14th Amendment has not really altered traditional federalism. So remember, under federalism, the state and federal government really share powers. Federal government has powers, the state government has powers, and they share powers. And basically what it's saying is, even though the 14th Amendment has created all these, civil rights protections, the states really control what happens in their states. So in some ways, it sort of takes a shot at the 14th Amendment and sort of what we say presages what's going to happen under Jim Crow. And so these victorious Democrats, they win in 74 in the House, and in 75 they're brought into power. They call themselves redeemers because they claim to have redeemed the South from the corruption of these biracial governments, with the scalawags and the carpetbaggers and freed people, and finally we sort of are getting the South back. Now, the presidential election of 1876, which Foner does a poor job of, I think, explaining, and I did a poor job of writing poor job. I didn't even write the word job in the reading questions. I wrote Foner does a poor blank. So in the presidential election of 1876, the Republicans are going to nominate an Ohioan named Rutherford B. Hayes. The Democrats are going to choose a Northerner, Samuel Tilden. Okay, so it's sort of two Northerners running against each other. And by the time of the election, only South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana remain under Republican control in the South. So all these other states they're now under Democratic control. And so the election turns out to be so close in these 4 states. And whoever wins these states, South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, did I say 4 states? I think 3 states, is basically going to win the election. But both the Democrats and the Republicans both say they won the states. It's like, we win. So whoever wins the presidency. So they can't figure out in Congress what to do. So they create a commission. It's got 15 members, 5 senators, 5 representatives, 5 Supreme Court justices. Now, way back, we saw in 1824, when no one got the majority of electoral college votes, it went to the House of Representatives. This was different. It's because they just couldn't figure out what to do with these disputed votes. Now, again, it's impossible to split 15 evenly, and it was actually 8-7 in terms of Republicans. So it was no surprise, with more Republicans than Democrats on the committee or on the commission, that the members decide that all the votes go to Hayes and not to Tilden. Now, believe it or not, Tilden needed one vote. He only needed one, yet all 19 of the votes, I believe, went to Hayes. But even as this commission is deliberating late in 76 and into 77, there's these behind the scenes negotiations that are taking place between the leaders of the parties. And the sort of back and forth and the compromise is the Democrats are listen, we'll make sure that Hayes gets to be president, and we'll respect the civil and political rights of Black people if Hayes sort of lets us be. So it's okay, the Democrats are willing to give up the presidency to sort of get the South back, if you will. And so Foner calls it the bargain of 1877. I've always called it corrupt bargain 2.0. Hayes becomes president. The Republicans get the presidency. I should say they keep the presidency, as Ulysses S. Grant had before him for 2 terms had been a Republican. And the way I've always taught it is that Hayes basically says, as soon as he is quote unquote chosen by the committee, okay, all the federal troops come back from the South to the North. Foner, who I trust more because he's a Reconstruction expert, basically says that he orders them back to their barracks, and that some will stay and some will go home. But at the end of the day, the triumphant Southern Democrats, they're yeah, no way are we actually going to live up to our pledge to recognize Blacks as equal citizens. That would be ridiculous. And so we really see that in 1877, Jim Crow is going to rise up and the South is going to be redeemed. And so we have to look at this 12-year period of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877 and evaluate it. Was it positive? Was it negative? Did it have any enduring impacts? So even after 1877, some African Americans were able to vote and hold office, but you're going to see some pretty serious attempts to really repress that Black political opportunity. When we look back, Republicans controlled the South and Blacks exercised significant political power, and the federal government took on the responsibility protecting the fundamental rights of American citizens. Well, that's over. That protection is done, and it's done pretty fast. It's the North pretty much just washes its hands of all of that responsibility. But despite its limitations, Reconstruction is an extraordinary chapter in the story of American freedom. Just to think about the Black political opportunity that existed for just a brief moment in time, however. But it's nearly a century later that we're actually going to see this finally come to fruition. And in many ways, the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s and the 1900s is known as a second Reconstruction, because 13th Amendment freedom, 14th Amendment citizenship, civil rights, 15th Amendment Black male suffrage, that's pretty much denied from 1877 into the mid 1900s. So it's going to take almost a century to sort of make it all happen. But it did happen, albeit briefly, during that time period that the Republican North really had control. And then it was gone, just like that.